Welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. My name's Jacob Reynolds, the head of policy for MCC Brussels, and today delighted to be joined by our executive director, Frank Füredi.
Glad to be here.
We're here because Frank has just published his latest book, The War Against the Past, Why the West Needs to Fight for Its Future. And this, if you've been following our work, you'll know that this features as a theme throughout lots of the discussions we've been having about history, about the culture war, about even a recent report that we had on the sexualization of children. So really delighted to have a chance to dig into these topics with Frank. And I guess to kick us off, it'd be interesting to know, like, what was the genesis of this book? Why did you start thinking that you had to write a book about the war against the past?
Well, it kind of snuck up on me. I began to realize that although the symptoms of the conflicts are about things like gender or Black Lives Matter, or they're about different cultural issues to do with abortion, suicide. Nevertheless, underneath all these conflicts, there seemed to be a continuous, remorseless process of calling into question the moral status of the past. And one of the things that I've noticed as a key element within our cultural conflicts is this determination to render the past, particularly the past of the West, toxic, and almost kind of create the impression that if you look back upon your history, unless you acknowledge that your history is a story of shame, then you're on the wrong side of history. And it seemed to me that people only saw the most visible symptoms of that. So, for example, they could see that statues were being torn down. Look at what's going on. People only see the most visible signs of the war against the past, which are attempts to pull down statues, calls to rename streets, make sure that they no longer have any organic links with the past. There are attempts to basically criticize paintings and buildings. But what they don't see is that underneath it all is also a lot of other things. So, for example, school children are continually being indoctrinated by a kind of history which teaches them that essentially their past itself is something that they need to be skeptical about, almost afraid of, and certainly feel guilty about what their ancestors have done. And if we indoctrinate children to feel guilty about who they are, then basically you dispossess those kids of the capacity to develop their identity or to feel any pride in their parents, in their ancestors, and their community.
So yes, I'd like to come back to this topic of the West and Western civilization in a bit, but I guess I first wanted to ask you, you've been studying cultural conflicts for a long time. You've written books that kind of cover 100 or more years of history looking at these conflicts. So where do you date the kind of war against the past? When does that really, for you, begin to kick in?
Well, I think that children represent the future. And one of the things that people have learned over the last century, or at least they think they've learned, is that children are much easier to indoctrinate than the older generations. Children are more suggestible. Imagine that you have kids who have got no experience of what has gone on beforehand, who are not familiar with the rituals and the practices and the ways of their community, who basically are almost like blank sheets as far as the teachers are concerned. So they come to schools, and they can be indoctrinated much faster than any of the other generations, and that's why you have a situation where almost overnight you have a whole generation of young people in many parts of the West who declare that they are not proud of their nation. In fact, they are ashamed of being British or Australian or American. They are not particularly interested in the symbols and the rituals of their society. They despise their own flags. They would rather fly an LGBTQ flag than the flag of their own nation. And therefore, children become extremely vulnerable to this targeting. And the reason why I wrote the book is because, as far as I'm concerned, we lost about 3-4 generations of young people who've been indoctrinated in this hysterical sort of a dehumanization of what has gone on in the past and what has happened in history. And therefore we are at risk of creating one generation after another who have completely detached themselves from where they come from. And that will have a very disruptive, and is already having a very disruptive effect on public life.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, buried in that is the question of, well, why is the past really so important? I mean, today we live in a time where we're told that everything is so new and unprecedented, from globalization to digitization. We're kind of told that those elements of our history, they can't really shine any light on the present, and that it's actually quite difficult to use the past as a guide. We're told it's kind of basically irrelevant what happened in the past. So you've kind of studied this sociologically, philosophically. Why is the past so important, and what is it about having a kind of sense of our past that helps us build the future?
It was in the 1970s that many of the old ideologies unraveled and where they ceased to have any influence upon public life. It's in the 1970s that you have a generation of elites who run our institutions, our cultural institutions, our education systems, and even other sectors of public and private life, who have become educated into a way of thinking that was antithetical to those of their ancestors. So in the 1970s, you have a generation of people who running our societies, who feel completely alienated from their own past, and who not only feel alienated from their own past, but who actually believed that the way they gain legitimacy, the way they gain a degree of moral authority, is by being in the forefront of questioning in the past. And even many conservative politicians fell into this trap. And I always remember an incident where David Cameron, who was the then Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister of Britain, made a little speech where he referred to a racist incident. And he basically said, we're not going to go back to the bad old days of racism. And that really struck me, because in previous times, he talked about the good old days. Now, all of a sudden, the good old days were being displaced by the bad old days, by a conservative prime minister. And that showed that by the time we got to David Cameron from the 1970s onwards, these elites began to regard their own past in a very negative way. And not only regarded it that way, but they believed that it was their responsibility to criticize it and to basically call into question the taken for granted rituals and traditions of previous generations.
Yeah, and I guess that orientation distinguishes you a little bit from many conservatives, right, who just treat the past as something that's kind of happened and there to be revered, whereas you take the position that actually, if we're going to change anything in the future, that it's really important to have a relationship to our past. What does that kind of, I guess, genuine or dynamic relationship to the past actually look like?
Well, the bottom line is that our humanity depends on our relationship with previous generations. Unlike other species, human beings evolve and they learn from the experience of their parents and their grandparents and their ancestors. Human beings are never just simply the products of a particular biological event. They are the products of a journey that humanity has undertaken a long time ago. And each generation appropriates the experience of the past. It kind of revitalizes it. And as we evolve, our humanity depends on this constant process of keeping and conserving our tradition, revitalizing it, and then moving forward on the basis of that. And that organic connection that we have to previous generation, the transmission of knowledge that takes place from one generation to another, is essential for giving us the guidance that we need to make our way. We learn from the experience of the past. It doesn't mean to say that we simply repeat the past, but those experiences are constantly giving us the resources to know what to do in difficult circumstances. But not only that, particularly for the young, that connection gives young people the basis for their identity. So the young people who are born understand that they're not just basically abstract human beings just coming out of nowhere, but they come from a particular community, from a particular family, they have a particular religion, they have a particular identity, which makes them who they are. And that what gives them their sense of meaning and their place in the world. Now, if you take that away from them, and that's more or less what we're beginning to do now, then you undermine their capacity to develop and cultivate their identity. And we're seeing the destructive consequences of that, because once you have a crisis of identity on such a large scale, then you have everything from so-called mental health problems to a very disoriented, powerless group of young people who are, in a sense, afraid to look at the future and to try to basically take the kind of risks that are necessary to make that future their own.
And I guess, I mean, does that distinguish you in some ways from lots of other maybe fellow travelers in the world of conservatism, where the past is looked at as something that is almost to be revered, it can't really be changed, and that rather you have this kind of orientation that we have to have a connection to the past because it's precisely we have to engage in the future and we have to revitalize those traditions. It's not just, I mean, there's that term of John Stuart Mill's of dead dogma. It's no longer just, it's not just dead dogma, it has to kind of come alive through our engagement with it.
Yeah, it's a kind of dynamic relationship. So looking at the writings of Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, she really believed that the essence of education was conserving the past. But for her, the mission of conserving the past didn't mean that you just kept it the way it was, but that through the conserving of that past, that conservation element, you create and unleash a dynamic that allows you to revitalize it, to develop it. And to me, the most exciting example of how this occurs is the Renaissance, because the Renaissance was a period of rebirth, where what people were doing, particularly in Italy during this era, was taking the incredible insights of the ancient Greeks and Romans, being inspired by that, but at the same time, almost like redefining it and translating that into the experiences of their time and going forward. And to me, what we should be aiming for in our war against those people who want to destroy the past is our renaissance, our rebirth, where we take the insights and the legacy of European civilization, making it our own, acquainting the younger generations with it, and then going forward on the basis of that.
And that links very nicely to the topic I raised earlier about the kind of what seems to be a crisis of confidence or a crisis of belief in Western civilization. And it seems that, I mean, there's geopolitical manifestations of that, but also very close to home, there's this sense that politicians right across Europe or America or wherever, they can't answer this question of what is it that makes your societies distinct or unique or interesting or have something to offer the future. How do you link this, as you might call the crisis of the West, with this war against the past?
Well, I think the crisis of the West is, above all, a crisis of meaning. And meaning is something that, in the first instance, derives from our relationship to what has gone on before our existence. It's that human journey that has taken place over the centuries that provides us with some very important lessons that kind of tells us and gives us a language with which to understand our own world. It provides us with a philosophical insight, a moral outlook about what is right and wrong, a moral outlook that allows us to make judgments, that gives us the strength to deal with the complicated issues that arise in every single generation. And that is something that is very much a part and parcel of the tradition that we inherit. And if we don't have that, and or alternatively, if we basically become skeptical of it, we try to estrange ourselves from that and almost try to find another way of dealing with stuff, then we're in trouble. And our existing political elites seem to be much more comfortable with inventing new rules, new procedures. They try to invent values and norms that come out of nowhere. And of course, when you have values and norms that come out of nowhere, like diversity or inclusion, and I can give you a lot more examples like that, they might look all right on paper, but they are not going to give any meaningful insights into the world that we live in. So one of the reasons why we have the problems that we do is our elites have become morally illiterate. They really cannot speak in a language of right and wrong. They're not able to basically recognize the problems that confront us. And in that sense, they become prisoners of the fact that they're so detached from the past that they are trapped in the present. And that when you're trapped in the present, then there's no way you're going to find a way into the future.
Yeah, and I mean, you could add, as you do, you could add to that moral illiteracy, a kind of historical illiteracy, and it strikes me that that illiteracy is it's kind of as noticeable on people who you'd think of should be part of the right or conservatives as it is among the progressives who are kind of at the forefront of the culture war. So, what does a serious engagement with the past look like? If people think of themselves as conservatives or wanting to conserve so that we can transform the future, what does a real engagement with the past actually look like?
Well, a real engagement with the past will take place, and is taking place, through challenging those who are trying to contaminate it. In the first instance, we have got to settle a score with those people that are trying to make society feel ashamed and guilty about where they come from. And we have to, in the first instance, expose their agenda, what they're up to, what they're doing, and highlight the very empty, almost culturally suicidal character of their projects. So that's really quite important, that we take that on board in a very aggressive way, rather than just being defensive. Because very often what happens is they basically say that, President Jefferson in America was a slave owner, or they say that Winston Churchill was a war criminal, and all that we tend to say is, no, they weren't that. They were good guys, rather than basically asking the question, well, why are you attacking someone like Winston Churchill, who played such a crucial role in the defeat of Nazi Germany? What is it that makes you, want to do that? And we have to force them on the defensive. That's the first thing. And once we've done that, then I think we can then engage much more fruitfully and creatively in bringing to the young people's attention what are the really important experiences, episodes in European or Western history. What are the really important historical figures that we think have got something very important to say to us in the 21st century? And we can do no worse than go back to the Greeks in ancient Athens, take the kind of ideals that they were experimenting with, which are really as important today as before. I mean, Aristotle and his virtues have got tremendous significance in the 21st century. And we just got to discuss it, make it part of our educational system, so that young people begin to speak a different language. And in the course of speaking a different language, they begin to have a different moral outlook upon the world. And most important of all, they will feel a connection with something that happened a long, long, long time ago. It's when you begin to see Aristotle as something that actually means something to you in your life that we will have achieved a victory in this particular war, historical war.
Yeah, and it strikes me that if to the degree that there is an engagement with figures in the past, it's become kind of like an empty roll call of big names, and or like in the theatre where there's just like they repeat the same plays over and over again. In classical music world, it seems like they're reliant on a small number of kind of big hits, and part of that is because especially young people's engagement with the, say, key texts of Western civilization is so mediated. So not just like trigger warnings that tell you exactly what you need to think about the play or the philosophy before you read it, but people don't actually go back to the texts. And there's a paradoxical thing sometimes, isn't there, where actually the text feels a lot more modern and more fresh than any kind of modern interpretation of it. So is part of this about actually getting people to just go and refresh themselves with actually the text themselves, rather than these constant kind of mediations that we have.
One of the interesting things about the war against the past is that it creates a kind of social amnesia, historical amnesia, where we forget what happened beforehand. So we forget the fact that in the past, in the 19th, 18th, 19th century, most Europeans learned how to read by themselves or to their families. They didn't get that skill from school. You had a situation where in parts of Scandinavia, you had universal capacity to read, because the Lutheran Church there insisted that everybody had to learn to read the Bible. Today, 200-300 years later, we have reading problems, where even in the best schools of the West, they're saying that it's very difficult to teach young people how to read. And there's all these reading diseases that they talk about that people have. And that's the first thing, not realizing that actually if peasants in Denmark could learn how to read by themselves or with the help of their mothers, then why is it that now, today, we got these reading problems? That's where the past tells us that something has gone wrong. But not only that, if we then understand that reading is not something that is difficult, reading doesn't require expertise, skilled people with PhDs to teach you what to do, then the way we look at a book also changes. And I think that's really important. I think reading has become complicated and to some extent dispossessed of its inspirational content by the same process that has undermined our past, by basically disconnecting reading from the historical experience that we've undergone over the centuries. And I find that even someone like myself sometimes get influenced by this anti-reading ethos that's kind of lurking in the background. The other day I was really surprised, very pleasantly surprised, because I decided to reread Machiavelli's sort of The Prince. Mm-hmm. And I found myself completely absorbed in it and enjoying it in a way I never imagined I would. It was like a fantastically relevant book for my own life, for my own work in 2024, something that was written centuries ago. And that does tell us that reading, proper reading, and taking the books that made our civilization into what it is not an onerous task, but can be a very enjoyable experience if we open our imagination to it.
Yeah, I know that you're not necessarily a subscriber to the idea that technology is the root of all of our contemporary problems, but is there an element to which the kind of contemporary presentism is partly a function of our engagement with social media, which is relentlessly presentist, and all of those things, all those distractions, this age of distractions, as some people call it, that also gets in the way of actually attending to the key moments or the key texts in history? Is that part of it too?
No. I think that distraction is something that is talked about and occurs in every historical period. People get distracted when they haven't got any ideas that really inspire them, when they're not turned on by ideas and books. And then it's easy to get distracted if you have a boring teacher. Even in the university, you get distracted. If you have a teacher who has got really interesting ideas, who feels very passionate about their subject, you're going to become less distracted. I always tell the stories of what happened a long time ago during the Roman Republic, ancient Roman Republic, when you had people writing books about the fact, or they were in books because they were in scrolls, about the fact how young people seemed to be distracted because there were too many literary products for them to read. And you went to a library in Rome, and there wasn't all that many stuff around to get distracted by. But even then, people were distracted. So it wasn't the social media. It wasn't any particular digital technology that's responsible for that. It's our relationship to the domain of ideas and the way that we expose young people to those ideas that influences the way that people read or not read. Yeah. And I think that's important for us to realize. Otherwise, we fall into the trap of digital determinism.
Yeah. I mean, so getting back to more directly on the war in the past, one of the kind of signal features on the main battlegrounds for the war of the past really is language, is the need to control language, to control what it is that not just can and can't be said, but how things are talked about. And everything now is renamed in a kind of in a new fashion, which suggests, doesn't it, that one of the key battlegrounds to fight back against is the domination of language.
It's a very important area because it is through the control of language that people can control us. Because language isn't just about words, it isn't just about symbols that those words represent. It's also about ideas and the way we think and the words we use, the language that we use to express ourselves. influences the way we think. And if we're now told that a word like or words like wives and husbands are abolished, and we need to have other more formulaic words like partners introduced, then the unique feature of what it is to be a wife or what it is to be a husband is entirely lost. You're a partner. It means something very, very different.
Yeah.
And we forget that that the new words that are being brought in aren't just more so-called progressive words
Or more inclusive. Yeah.
or more inclusive words. They are words that give meaning to human experience.
Yeah.
That's very different than beforehand.
Yeah, and I mean, this links to something else. I know that already some of your reviewers and commentators on the book have kind of picked up on the fact that you're pretty insistent that it's not like there is a kind of conflict over history going on the one hand, and then somewhere else there's a kind of cultural conflict going on about that, for example, involves the gender debate or things like that. You're pretty insistent that these are part and parcel of of basically the same cultural war. But why is that? Why is it that things that seem like they're about in the past are actually related to very contemporary discussions around, say, gender ideology?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that if you talk to or read the books of gender ideologists, they all make the point that the first battle and the most important battle they had to fight is language. It's changed the words that we use, changed the pronouns that we use. That was the first battle. And that wasn't really incidental, because if you change the language, then and get rid of the language of the past, then your mission is half accomplished. But that's not all there is to it, because it's interesting that, for example, trans ideologists don't just talk about what's going on now. They want to legitimate themselves by rewriting history. So they're continually going back and saying that the trans experience is trans-historical. It existed at all times. They do things like go back to ancient Egypt, and they tell archaeologists who are looking at human remains in the pyramids of ancient Egypt that if you find a human remain, you mustn't call that human remain a man or a woman, even though the DNA test indicates it's a man or a woman, because apparently we don't know how they would have identified themselves. So they take their story about I identify as this or I identify as that, which is a very modern accomplishment. They kind of project that back into ancient Egypt and basically prevent us from knowing what these human remains were all about. And that kind of attempt to impose a trans frame of reference on everything in the past is really quite important. So you'll know, for example, that people who are strong women who have historical significance, like Joan of Arc, are frequently claimed to be a heroine of the trans movement. She must have been trans. Or even someone like Queen Elizabeth I, because she was a fairly bolshy individual, not the most feminine of people, it's been often suggested that she couldn't have been heterosexual. She had to be either a lesbian or a trans kind of person. So you do have this little game that is being played where the past is rewritten as to use their language, the past is being queered and deprived of its normal historical content, and a past is kind of create a fictional past, which is there to displace the genuine past that we all know much about.
And the other link, I guess, between these two phenomena is that, like man, woman, they're historical categories that mean something historically. To be a man is traditionally identified with a certain set of masculine virtues. To be a woman is identified with a certain set of historical feminine virtues, and so on. And it seems that part of what's happened through the progression of the war against the past is the undermining of the validity of those historical categories. And that gives rise, does it not, to this kind of sense that no one's really quite sure what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman. And then the natural progression of that are things like gender ideology.
I think it is. I think you're right to suggest that when you have the historically developed, organically developed roles and relationships called into question, because they will then say there's something inherently wrong with it, that being a man is problematic, being masculine is even worse, because it's an invitation to toxic masculinity. So what happens is that man and woman kind of categories acquire a kind of a negative quality to them. And this negative quality then means that the identities, which are foundational to human development, are called into question. You have to remember that when a child is born and they are beginning to develop an identity, the first identity they develop is their identity is either as a girl and a boy. They will know that, you know, I as a girl, I'm not like a boy, and vice versa. And if you begin to call that into question at that early age, and then force them into a situation where when they're 5 or 6, they're told, you may think you're a girl now, but you might change your gender later on, then you sow confusion to the point at which those young people get screwed up, messed up, and are no longer clear about who they are and what they should be.
Yeah. And then I guess to end, I mean, we talk a lot at MCC Brussels. We try and do a lot of work around populism, and we've seen recently in the German elections some examples of populism. But I wonder how you interpret populism in relation to the war against the past, because often populism will be talked about, say, about certain economic issues or about immigration or about the war in Ukraine or something. But it seems to me that bubbling under the surface, and sometimes very explicitly in lots of these populist movements, is also a kind of reaction to this attempt to colonize the past, to rewrite it, to rob people of the things that they understood. And is not part of populism as well an attempt to reclaim the sense that we are German, we have a particular history, we are French, we have a particular identity through our history? Is that also part of what's going on in this populist moment?
I think it is, because the war against the past is a war that comes from above. It's not a war that began on the streets of cities or in villages or in the countryside. And most people who are concerned about the war against the past tend to be drawn towards populist movements for a very simple reason, that they are the ones that they have the strongest sense of history, particularly of national history. They have the strongest need for the kind of clarity that an identity rooted in the past gives them. For them, understanding that they come from a place that was inhabited by people like them for centuries is a source of a positive identity. The very fact that they have an organic connection to people that have gone on before them is something that gives them a sense of security, understandably. And to that extent, you'll find that for populism, that the past and its rituals and the kind of values that were thrown up beforehand are inextricably linked to their public, political, and cultural outlook. And that's why what you have today is not just simply a political difference between populist parties and the old technocratic managerial ones, but also a conflict of values. And these values, the conflict of values, are really fundamentally a conflict between values that are rooted in the past. For example, Christianity, which has got a long history, as opposed to values that have been invented yesterday.
And so I guess to end then, I mean, that's something we will be throwing our weight behind, isn't it? And trying to articulate what is worth defending in the past, and saying that a key part of the populist struggle is get out of our history, allow us to reclaim our history.
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, but encourage people who are involved in politics and who are drawn towards populist movements to have a stronger sense of history, and not to be bullied to be ashamed about the fact that they are French or German or English, but to take a certain amount of pride in their in their historical legacy. I think it's very important that these movements make a virtue out of the cultural inheritance that is there to be taken forward, and make a virtue out of the fact that they are part of something that is much bigger than the present generation that they're involved in. They're part of a long existing kind of human community that goes back thousands of years, and that is as much ours today as it was theirs thousands of years ago.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Frank. We encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book. It's a really enjoyable but really important read. So thanks very much, Frank.
Pleasure.